Willkommen zurück.
Welcome back. Welcome to Forum 16, Digital Work, Potential for a New Humanization or a Job Killer. We were given the opportunity to stay in this big room, and I like that. And I think that it is also enjoyable to be the only room with flowers. And on top of that, we have an intriguing topic with very interesting panelists. I would like to, first of all, introduce myself and then tell you what my function is. And on the internet, you can find me as the head of the Böckler Stiftung of the communication, but also in the brochure, it says that I'm head of policies with the SPD, but I'm also a member of the SPV as the magazines, and we're very proud of co-hosting this event. So I'm not actually schizophrenic, but I do have very many hats that I'm wearing today. What are we discussing today? We're talking about digitalization and what it does to the labor market. And we talked about the framework conditions and how they have been changing, and in what way digital economy is emerging. And I'm sure that we're going to talk about that as well, because there are cross-sectional topics as well. But let's focus on the labor market, especially. So through when you see in what the discussion is like in media, so there are robots employed everywhere, and there are images of manufacturing halls without any humans in there. And then we have a fear of digitalization, but this is actually not a new phenomenon. It didn't happen just yesterday, but it has been with us for decades. But we would like to discuss how it changes work and how it changes the quality of work. And this also is reflected in the images everywhere in the media, but also in the sciences. And there are, for example, scholars and scientists that go beyond time and space and they deal with everything all at once, and talking about humanization of labor, but at the same time the digital conveyor belts, and which is to be seen as a digital communication room that exists. And we have both worlds at the moment, and our question is, how can we turn digital work into decent work? And as I said before, so we have three brief presentations from the three fields of the research and politics, as well as the trade unions. And the way that we're going to proceed is that the politics and research will then form the brackets first. And then I'm going to introduce the panelists in more detail when they start. So there is, for example, Björn Böhning. He's the Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. You can applaud them all at the end of the presentations. And then we have Timo Daum, who is an award winner, and Burmeister, who works for the Metal Workers Trade Union. Now you can give them an applause to welcome them all. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask two questions at the end of my introduction, and this was what it was imposed on me through this stringent editing of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. And now that I've talked about how we're going to proceed, let's get started. Björn Böhning, he is a civil servant, and I'm not going to talk about all his functions that he's had before, but maybe the most important one. So he was the chairman of the youth organization of the Social Democratic Party Germany, but I would like to focus on his current job. And in the Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, there was the white paper on the work 2.0 as the results of a working group, and he's also a member of the think tank. And as far as I have heard, this is a cultural transformation, and I would like to quote his statement in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and said, the think tank is not going to be a debating club of the ministry, but rather develop policies. And now I would like to ask Mr. Böhning, so what changes have you observed in the labor market, and what do you want to do about it? Thank you very much. I mean, we've been going through a lengthy process, and we worked on labor in 4.0 under Andrea Nahles already, and now we're going to mirror the results of our work in the labor world and make suggestions for new policies. Basically, we see three types of developments, and right from the outset, I would like to say that digitalization is not only a process in the labor market, but also covers other social fields, for example, has intrinsic cultural aspects as well. So I would like to state that at the outset so that I won't forget it. But we see three types of development. So that is, for example, the alienation of corporations, so that corporations play a lesser role, but rather the platforms play a more important role. So either the generic platforms of a corporation, so for example, Uber and others, and German companies such as Delivery Hero, and they stand for the crowd economies, or the gig economies as they are called now. But we also see that the corporations inside, they also change, and there are reshoring effects because everybody is focused on platforms. So everything that has been really outsourced is now taken back to Europe, but it is also changing the labor contracts and the worker economies and team building processes, and also the hierarchies within the corporations. This is something that the trade unions need to deal with, because the conventional foreman in a manufacturing company no longer exists. So we have a dissolving of the corporational boundaries. And of course, this has an impact on social law, but also on corporation law. And this leads to the fact that the conventional ways of working times, regulations, and other types of work-related regulations are questioned and challenged. And this is why we are faced with the question, when you have a conventional worker and this person no longer exists, and to exaggerate it even further, then you have platforms such as Deliveroo, because there was a discussion that we've had in the past few months that do not see themselves as employers, but rather some kind of neutral mediator between the service provider and the consumers. But they do not want to accept the conventional structure of being an employer that comes with obligations and requirements, and also responsibility. And they don't want to take that responsibility any longer. So this is why we need more new policies to regulate all that and control all that. And the second level that I would like to talk about is the work organization. That is the organization of the employees and workers themselves. And we see two tendencies here. So we have a change on values. So that is the attitude of the workers themselves, so that they are asked to be very flexible, and also with regard to the compatibility of their work life and their family life, and also with regard to working hours. And mobile work, for example, is something that they are asked to do more and more, and corporations, they really require them actually to work wherever they are. And this is some type of forced situation that the workers and employees find themselves in. And then we also see the values changing and attitudes changing, but at the same time there are new forms of work and more flexible work, and that it goes in the direction of more self-employed people, and this is a huge challenge for us as well. So for example, with regard to social security, so how can we deal with people who are no longer conventional type employees or workers? How can we integrate them into our social security systems, and how can we agree on a flexibility consensus and then establish a balance between what the corporations need and also what the employees need, and with regard to working hours, for example, but also with regard to social security. And this is something that we're going to do next year. So, for example, we want to limit the firing of people without any due course, and but this also affects European employees working in Germany, for example, and we're going to make proposals about that as well, so that they will have a stronger position and with regard to their rights, for example. And there's also something that we are projecting at the moment in our research work, so that the data that we presented as the Labour Ministry, so that it says that by 2025 there will be having 1 million new jobs, but at the same time 1.3 million jobs will disappear by 2025. So when you look back to the Industrial Revolution, and we've seen several examples of that, and this is a very speedy process. And this has an impact on people, on their concerns, and also on how they feel. And we need to take that into consideration. And this is why I'm saying we need an idea. And if I can say that also on behalf of the Labour Ministry, but also on behalf of social democracy, how we can deal with this structural transformation. And we should do that in such a way that we should not only focus on saying that you, employees, workers, you need to just adjust and adapt and that's it, but rather how we can have more just structures for the employees and workers. So how can we go through a structural transformation that makes one person to go from one job to another, from one career to another, through, for example, requalification measures, retraining measures that will become necessary. And it won't happen by telling the employees themselves that they need to train themselves, but rather by giving them more securities and by co-shaping the structural process and structural transformation ourselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Böhning. So I just did some of my calculations, but you said 800,000 jobs plus. So, well, this is exactly the figure. Structural transformation airbag, that was a measure that was also part of the results of the working group. And we're going to talk about your measures later on in more detail and about the structure of the labor market. But I would like to give the floor now to Timo Daum, and he's more in a central position. I would like to introduce him. He's a scientist, and he teaches in online media and digital economies. He is a physicist by training, because that's good, because he really knows what he's talking about. And he's worked in the IT sector for a very long time, and this is also quite beneficial for the analysis. And we just heard that we need to understand our business models. If we don't understand them, then we can't control them. But what is most important today for our event today, so he is the author of the book Capital, That's Us, and us in capital letters. And this is about the digital economy. Now, of course, I've read his book already, and the quality label here on this book says that he has been awarded with the book prize of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in 2018. And it is a very interesting topic that he is discovering here. So what would Karl Marx say about Google and Twitter and Facebook? But that's what you can read on the cover. But it's actually about more. It is about the siliconization of the world. And this also has a serious impact on our labor markets. And I would like to ask you, Timo Daum, how is this siliconization of the world changing the labor conditions, the work as such, and workers, and how can we turn that into something positive? Thank you very much. Thank you for these kind words of introduction. So the term, so the siliconization is the word. I mean, it is a bit of a mouthful. So for me, siliconization worked quite well. I mean, it would also work. Siliconization, that's the term, and it was coined by a Frenchman. The federal German government and the big parties, they promise full employment by 2025. And I only have 8 minutes in order to explain why I believe that, in contrast to that, to what we see in the 21st century with regard to digital capitalism, what it is about the end of proletarian work. And Donald Postauer, he is a social critic from Chicago, and he would call it that way. Karl Marx, I mean, you can see his image behind me, so he looks into a 3D future, and in his main work, you can find the word the workforce and the entrepreneur. So he uses that term in one chapter in order to say that the workers, the manual workers, are enjoying freedoms as never before, so that they can turn into entrepreneurs themselves as selling their workforce. At the same time, he also uses the word wage slavery. He also wanted to make sure that this work for remuneration, also in historical developments, can end up in non-freedoms, in slavery, and he turned that into a historical continuity. This work for remuneration, for wages, is something that has been developed historically in the course of the Industrial Revolution. Everything that has been grown over history can also disappear. And what is accompanying this type of wage work? And for the first time, we needed a lot of people who were punctually in the mornings at 6 o'clock. They go to a place and very precisely do the same work every morning, as precisely as possible. And the virtues that come with that is punctuality, loyalty to the company, but also full employment, social security, social partnerships. Wolfgang Streeck calls the social market economy and social partnership, and Lenin calls that the workers' aristocracy that has accepted to be bought out. This is a compromise, and it comes as a surprise that this was discontinued by capitalism and has been done so since the 70s. And capitalism says, no, we don't want to exploit workers any longer. And a parallel development to this was the development of changes, the changing requirements of work. Agility is a buzzword that actually comes from software, but has now arrived in the world of work structures. And here it is about leaner management, own responsibilities, shorter product cycles, meaning that there are relatively safe departments and competencies that have grown over time. They are replaced by projects. And Chapelleau and Potanski are the two French scientists. They summarize that the paradigm of the factory is replaced by the paradigm of the project. So you are only as good as your last project. So how relevant is this approach, that the entrepreneurization of the worker, as I call it, how relevant is that? Let me give you 3 facts. Stephen Hill says that there are 1 million people in Germany in irregular working conditions, and around the world, so 70 million people work on digital platform, and they offer micro work activities and do their trading there. So the company Uber, we all know that, and it is the poster child of a platform economy, and they only have a few thousand employees and focusing on algorithms mainly and marketing. So they are omnipresent, however, in a lot of countries, and they have millions of drivers who are, formally speaking, self-employed people. So they are no longer employees. And when you look at China, and this is something that people like to do when they want to have big figures there, the government announced that in 2016 that several millions of workers will be released from the steel industry in inverted commas. And what are they going to do with them? So they are going to be re-educated. I mean, that's an exaggerated way of doing that, but retrained to work somewhere else and to do the Chinese work way of Uber work. And their business models will change, and they are self-employed, and they drive their own cars and offer their services. So let me come to the conclusion of my presentation. Kurt Berg, he reminded us of Karl Marx, and he said that he was confronted with a lot of changes and challenges in the labor world, but there are quite a lot of parallel developments here as well. So we live in the early times of digital capitalism, and the workers need to renew themselves, and capitalism has entered a new phase in which wages are no longer paid to the masses, but rather that we are going to become small entrepreneurs on platforms, all of us, and that our position in the market will change, or that we will become market players. And work is changing, so the forms of work are changing. And just one sentence at the very end of my presentation, that the wages are going down, and there's a spiral downwards, and this is just a consequence and not a cause. And at the same time, the discussion on the basic income without any conditions, this is also a symptom of this development. And people call that very often that this is the social system of digital capitalism. Thank you very much, Timo Daum.
Before I hand over to Kai Burmeister in a moment, because he has to tell us why the Labour movement doesn't have to start from scratch, or maybe it does. He can think about that. I know it's not a good way of doing it, but we have so much to discuss and no immediate contradiction so far. But there are still a few matters we need to clarify for later. First of all, let's look at the structural change aspect. That doesn't mean retraining miners to become, digi operators, but we can discuss what are the new jobs that are emerging, because people are saying 800,000 new jobs altogether are likely to emerge through digitization, but that doesn't tell us anything about what sort of jobs they are, in which sectors of industry, and what type of work that's going to be, and what status it will have. So that's something we need to discuss. We've heard quite a lot about it already, that we need to debate what Björn also addressed by saying that companies are changing their structures. He talked about platformization of the labour market and so on. So relevant matters are changing. Now I would like to introduce to you Kai Burmeister. He's a secretary of the trade union at IG Metall Baden-Württemberg, and he's working in an area which is pretty interesting, because we often say that the metalworking industries is old union, but he knows a lot about the transformation of the car industries, and he's making some thoughts about what happens if we phase out the combustion engine, what will happen there. So quite exciting. His view is we shouldn't just talk about opportunities and risks, as we often do, but we should talk about powers and interest. So maybe Marx behind me would say the same thing. He's giving us, going to give us an interesting insight into his area of work. Will the digital car make us all lose our jobs, is what he's going to say. And then he's going to speak from a trade union angle and, about this type of labour. And he's also going to talk about what room for discretion is there to humanise work 4.0, which has a lot to do with digital work. So Kai, go ahead. Thanks very much, Christina Schildmann. So you've just given me a whole host of jobs to do. Not much time. Yeah, I know, the clock is ticking. So we've heard quite a lot about the previous speakers, and I agree with much of what they say, namely that we're dealing with the fact that new things are happening here. The example of the cab drivers, and that we are faced with the question, how can we safeguard them? And of course, there are lots of sort of buzzwords that Timo Daum has made up, like agile work or creativity. I mean, even at Daimler, people aren't wearing ties anymore, after all. That's point of view to the CEO at the AGM not wearing a tie. Now, I can give you the example of the automotive sector in Baden-Württemberg and what I see here. All the buzzwords we've heard, flexibility, people these days can do more. It's an employee's market, and it has a lot to do with the fact that people are able to push forward their interests in order to have more mobile work opportunities. But at the same time, let's look more closely and say we should and are happy to have both in the modern automotive sector. We've got people who love in teams, do development work, where they doing things in a very creative manner. But equally, you still have, and it's a good thing, the traditional, conventional production type work, which we still want to retain to Baden-Württemberg and to Germany, even if there might not be a combustion engine in the future. And still we have shift work and working in intervals. And the only way you can produce a car is if everybody starts at 6 a.m. in the morning. But we still have some people, employees, which we tend to forget in this discussion about the new modern labour world, where people have demands for more ergonomical work, for more self-determination. But these are the people that are often forgotten at conferences like this, and we shouldn't forget them. So please, let's also pay attention to the work of manufacture and production, where there is still a future. So let's see what room for manoeuvre there is in that type of labour market. You said we shouldn't just talk about opportunities and risks. That's very important, what Ebert Foundation has done here. All power to business, question mark? Of course I could to give you a story saying, well, let's look at the developers. After all, they can work in a self-determined way around the clock. Quite apart from that, that's not true. Employers, of course, now saying, as Mr. Böhning mentioned, whether our working hours laws are still up to date. And I'm saying it's not the regulation that's the problem. The problem is rather that the supervisory authorities of the labour market haven't got the right staff. And it's not that we have the wrong laws. I mean, people can only work for 8 hours. That's what medical experts on labour tell us. Anything else would be detrimental to our health. And that's where we have a problem. So I'm not afraid of digitisation. I think, the opportunities definitely do outweigh the risk because they've improved working conditions. But I'm extremely cautious when you hear calls from the employers saying that our working hours regulations no longer fit the demands of the modern day and age because it comes from the last century and we should throw it overboard. I'm saying as a unionist, no, laws, labour, safeguards are to be prioritised, and that affects the people on the forklift truck as much as anybody else, because if the guy on the forklift truck is tired, it gets dangerous for everybody else as well. But the challenge is to see both sides. The world of what you call the old economy, what is happening there, how will labour conditions happen there, but we also need to embrace what's new. And I don't think the two should be mutually contradictory. You mentioned the car industry. We're quite aware in our estimation that the automotive sector in Baden-Württemberg is going to change in the near future. And not everybody employed there will have that future and continue to do the same job. For example, if I no longer have combustion engines or the same amount of combustion engines. The problem is, even if you don't do the same type of job, we still have to carry you with us into this future. We're talking about airbags. I mean, safety in change. We must make sure that in the companies that we have people on board throughout the transformation process, because if we don't, we have a problem in the companies that there is this attitude where people look backwards, where there is more right-wing populism gaining ground. That's a danger. So it's quite important for companies, so we're talking about all power to business, we have to make sure business will help institute the type of change in the companies that is socially acceptable. I believe that, when you ask whether IG Metall is worried about agile labour, no. I think if you're looking at the various memorandums to agility, there is a promise in there, namely that people will no longer have the conventional type supervisor, your boss who will control you, the sort of typical control and hierarchy set up, that you can overcome all of that. And companies offer a new type of democratic working culture. And I'd love to test that out, whether companies really do it. So I'd always say, as IG Metall, we're interested in seeing whether good, decent working conditions, more creativity, more self-determination can indeed be achieved by having more agility in the labour market in the company. And I think the only way you can achieve that is when you have clear rules. Sometimes I think people talk about democratic companies, and if the employers do that, they think it means employees, they have a voice, but the unions and the shop stewards haven't got a voice at all anymore. Then I get suspicious. Because I believe, obviously, as a union, we are important too. We want to have a voice and make sure that employees have a voice, but we want to reflect that. But employees' self-determination and unions are not contradictory. If you have individual self-determination, you can only do that on the basis of a good collective co-determination setup. So 2 thoughts on that. At the company Bosch, we've just done an innovative collective bargaining agreement, which newspapers called collective bargaining for the elite. I think it's possible to do that even for modern types of work, we can make sure that safeguards like co-determination and collective bargaining agreements can be set up. And it would be a brilliant thing if we could do something similar for the Uber drivers or for those people who are, driving shared economy vehicles from A to B. They should also be jobs with proper safeguards. So that's one thought which I wanted to share with you. And because somebody talked about further education training, we all agree that this is important. And I'd like to tell you that recently I spoke to the father of another daughter who shares a kindergarten with my own daughter, and he works as an engineer for an automotive supplier. And he says, my company is now offering further training education courses. And I'd like to do that. Quite apart from the fact, as you know, as a family father, it's not always that easy. And the company actually promotes that, supports this. The problem is, he is in development and he's working in a department where even today they've got very few people and they don't know how to cope with all the work they've got. And while we were strolling about with our kids, as he said, well, if I do that, the company as a whole thinks it's great. But if I'm out here for a year or two and always miss my job in my department, I don't need to ask my superior because he'll say no. And I think this is going to be the balancing act because we have full order books, but the people who feel blocked, how can we make sure that these obstacles that exist in everyday life in the company can be removed? We're saying, yeah, qualifying, skilling is all wonderful and important, but then you have immediate superiors saying no, and throw spanners in the works. That was just one example. Also, financial safeguards for people who go for training is another matter, but we're talking about it. Oh, we'll definitely be talking about that too. But you haven't quite answered the question whether unions have to start from scratch, but we get back to that later because I'll link that up to my right of the first question and the second question as well. Let me say very briefly what we've learned so far. On the one hand, we've got Daimler-type working conditions. We're not wearing a tie, not even I am, but let me try and sort of create a bit of a bridge for the next subject. We've been discussing matters. How can we make sure that companies have agile work in such a way that it is democratization rather than simply optimizing of work processes, where we'll hear Mr. Böhning later on, but later, I hope. Then we also ask ourselves, how can we shape and accompany change? Then we talked about the innovation collective bargaining agreement at Bosch. After all, we're talking about in-house jobs within that one company. We assume that that company will continue because it's in the automotive sector, but the automotive sector is also changing, melting down, consolidating, and we'll see. Maybe come back to that. I would like to go back to another thing, and that is the working strength of a company. Karl Marx talked about all of these matters. Voss and Vosgerat came up with it again in 1998 and said the productive power of the individual is something which may well be seen in the sense of a future model, but history condemned them for that. But now the productive power of the employee is coming back because we see that somebody has to sell his and her productive power in the labour market without any safeguards. And we have Timo here sitting, and I'm going to go back to him because he's talking about the future gainfully employed person as constituting part of an army of highly qualified, multilingual, adaptable to many different cultures individual. I can't read what I've written down here. I can't really find myself in this text. It's quite difficult. Sorry for stumbling through that. So, but the best thing is, workers of the future are a strange amalgam from customized digital Protestant working moral and yoga knitted self-determined individualism. We have to work with that because that is definitely something for employees that no structure or airbag can ever cope with. So now we're dealing with the employees outside a company, people working at digital platforms, which Björn had already mentioned. Some of them find it harder than others to make their money on these platforms. How do we deal with these people? What can we offer them from a point of view of law, from the social state, i.e. welfare benefits? What do we offer them in social terms? And what would we write on the to-do list, what we should do in politics, for example? How would we start? Björn, would you like to start with that? Yeah, well, we have our own data, which were a bit surprising to ourselves because they told us that about 5% of adults in gainful employment are now working in platforms and derive their main income from them. We had assumed it would be less than 50%, but our new monitor survey shows that we have an expansion on crowd working platforms and for click workers. Obviously, this is a surprise, primarily because our idea is still that people leave home in the mornings, go to work, and come back late afternoon. But obviously, these days, it's much more flexible. To some extent, you have sort of additional income generated. I mean, if you don't have money, you go and do a bit of click working for Amazon or somebody else. So all of that means that it's a situation which just goes beyond our normal boundaries, because working hours are also extended beyond what is standard. What do we do? One point I mentioned, we neither can nor will accept platforms simply position and see themselves as a neutral service provider between an employee and a third party. They act like employers. They have an employer function. They also assess the employment performance, even if it's by click. They define wage constituent elements to wages and salaries. They decide when you can start or when you cannot start. And in some areas, the platforms even decide that certain service providers can no longer deliver you pizza because they were rated poorly. So in other words, they fire people as well. Only their layers and their distribution and organization is different from what we know from established companies in the conventional sector, which is why we need to do two things. One is original rights still have to rule supreme, which is why we won't accept platforms preventing setting up work councils in Germany. That sort of culture may well be one that works in other countries or other economic systems. Maybe that's a role model there because it's disruptive innovation first. We know that. But we say the German model of Works Council and the social partners has been extremely successful when it comes to sustainable business. And it has kept Germany on a high growth path even until today. That growth trajectory is a good one, which is why we need to make sure that we have regulations against banning works councils to be set up. And a second thing which is very important concerns the fact that we need to start at the level of employment. To some extent, I fear we need to be concerned with our own labor regime, which is also something we're disputing with the unions, because that the regime that we have may be all perfect when it comes to the purely legal level, everything that we like, working hours, for example, or are you categorized as self-employed or employee? Because there's nothing in between in Germany. But with now this new compliance, as we call it in Germany, we have a different situation where we have employees and saying they don't use the legal rights they have, partly because they're forced to do it, that exists, and partly because they undermine their own legal rights. We know that. It's not all right that last night I write an email at 22:30 and appear back at my place of work at 7 in the morning. That actually violates the law on working hours, but hundreds of thousands of people in Germany do that, particularly academics, I must say. But that should be restricted. Still, we need to take care that we adapt our legal regimes to such an extent that certain types of employment will be possible. One example for the platform level is that, for example, in Austria, you have an employee type employer. It's a new type, something which is an in-between employer and employee, which is a bridging function, if you like, where original rights, right to representation, right to social benefits, right to non-availability, all of these can be focused on that in-between category, which we don't have in our established conventional system. I would love to have that debate. We'd love to have it in the ministry, and certainly we won't be able to have a law about this from the 1st of January, but still we need to make sure that we don't simply adhere to a situation which both employers and employees will no longer comply with anyway. Thank you, Mr. Böhning. We have made some thoughts about how to safeguard those who are not employees as categorized so far. So that's the debate is how to constitute an employee, or how can we translate that to the digital platform word. We will talk about companies in this respect again, because if we don't define a company as something which is local but maybe also digital, it should maybe people working there should enjoy the same rights? That's maybe one of the questions that could also help the unions. One of the other issues we discussed is the problem of safeguards for labor protection in the digital world, which also gives new jobs to unions, particularly works councils. But of course, that may not be sufficient. And if it isn't, then it may be up to government again to step in. Now, how do we do this? We had the sandwich system with the 3 speakers, and we should stick to that. So I'm staying with that concept. Now I'm asking Timo Daum. When we are talking and imagining a company as a digital company, would you think it's a possible outlook that the analog labor laws we have now can be transferred to the digital world as well, or is that concept one which, in your eyes, is no longer tangible or advantageous?
I think that the trade unions would be in a better position to answer that question. But I mean, we always look to science to help us. But when you say that trade unions are responsible, then I will give the floor to Kai. Well, I mean, I'm sure that I'll get the floor later on. So, okay, then I'll put you on the hot seat later on. You have the floor, Kai. If we have a new reality, such as the platform economy, in the metal workers union, of course, it plays a role, but not really an essential one. So it is more rather about the temporary workers. That is an issue for us as service providers and as the manufacturing industry. But Björn Böhning ask the question, when something is happening and when we have these click workers, then the question is, how can I put them into a safe and secure position? And I think that this is a very legitimate question. And this is exactly the history of the emergence of trade unions. So the history was not that we with Stuttgart, when Bosch and Porsche and Daimler said that they were going to do something about a car, but then called the metal workers union and said, would you allow us to put up a factory there? So, but the story was a completely different one. So the industry was first, and that manufacturing industry developed, and then the workers decided that the working conditions as they were are not acceptable, and that's why we need trade unions. And because trade unions cannot do everything, then we also need political regulations in place too. And this was exactly the point, that this is something that we need to think about, platform economy, and how to shape that together with workers' rights. And this is exactly the focus that I would like to incorporate into the discussion. It is not whether the social security rights are adequate, but rather where can we generate new ones so that they are adequate for the digital economy. And this is something that Björn has raised as an issue, and whether, for example, the working hours regulations are appropriate. And I don't think that it is the problem of of writing an email late at night that you respond to in an email. So we could ask a philosophical question: when you wake up in the middle of the night and you can think of something that is good for your work, does that count as work? And also with when I go for a walk on Sunday, I have brilliant ideas for my work. I mean, but I don't work on Sundays. But that is not the problem. The problem is that where we have companies with no trade unions responsible for that people in manufacturing production, they work longer because the truck has arrived late, and they need the working hours regulation because it is really difficult physical work when you work for 12, 13, 14 hours on one day and then only have 6 hours for sleeping before you need to do the same type of job one more time in the next morning. And this is why we need it. And this is something that hasn't been resolved by political approaches. We have a gap with mental health issues, and also the physical stress, but also psychological stress. And I'm not a philosopher, but I mean, speed is an issue, and how can we make people fit for this work? And we can't just ask them to do that so that they optimize themselves, but maybe they can do that for 1 or 2 or 3 years, but that won't make him healthy enough to enjoy a good pension, but rather that we need to close the gap on regulations for psychological stress and there is also the additional question, getting back to the fundamental question, that we don't need to start from scratch, but rather see the economic situation as it is, and how can we implement the technological progress in such a way that the employees can benefit from that, and it won't be at their expense. But this is what it is all about. So I would like to get back to that question and also ask it to Timo Daum. And then with what I have just read out was a quote from his book, but it is not an ideal world that he has envisaged for the workers, but this is his fear about what the development will look like. But you also wanted to respond to what Kai Burmeister said. Thank you very much for this figure, so 5% and the 50% increase that you have mentioned, that came as a surprise to me as well. But this is still a marginal figure. So I would like to remind you of his era when he wrote his major work, that the capitalist functioning of this new form that he saw emerging, that about 80% of the work was done in agriculture, and they were not really sure what these classics were all about. And I just wanted to mention that as an additional food for thought. I mean, trade unions starting from scratch, and what social security is as necessary. I would like to get back to that, and I'd like to pay homage to the slogans of this Sunday is mine, is the father's prerogative, and this is what they used as a slogan to campaign for a 5-day week. And this was a universalist slogan, because the workers in the mines and in the metal industry and in the printing industry, what they have achieved already, and that was pushed into the agricultural world and the world of hairdressers and trickled down to them. So when I then hear about the contracts for the elite with Bosch, or when Volkswagen signs their contracts, has nothing to do with the living reality of people working in Berlin, for example. It doesn't relate to them at all. And in that context, I see that trade unions do have to start from scratch and to get back to this idealism, so that you want to make a difference, and you want to make a difference for everyone. For example, when the hairdresser can benefit from it, for the truck driver and the creative people, the Uber drivers, and everybody around the globe can benefit from it. Thank you very much, Timo Daum. And I promise that I will open the discussion also for the floor. So please add your comments, your questions here from the audience. There's apparently a question here in the first row. You just wait for the microphone. It is coming to your seat in a minute. My name is Clemens Witte, Dialogues Installations, which is a research institute here in Berlin. I wanted to say something about retraining and requalification. So if artificial intelligence is developing at the same speed, then the question is, how do we access knowledge? And it may be too naive to say, or relative naive, saying that human beings can catch up with machines. And what are your solutions about that? And the second comment is about precarious work. I mean, this is nothing that has just emerged through the platform economy. It is also something that the German politicians wanted, and also it was wanted by social democracy as well. And I believe that the living realities with academics or people earning lower wages is far from what the trade union is focusing on. So let's collect a few questions and comments, if I may, and then we'll find the person who is going to respond. The lady in the 7th row, I think it is. You have the floor.
Serra from Argentina, from the trade union movement. I would have liked a little bit more of analysis about gender issues in the future world of work. I don't see much in it, and I think about platform workers, it's really important to have a gender point of view, because most of the workers in platforms are women, and we have seen that in the ILO study about platforms. And one idea that I came up with about responding to this is to humanize a little bit more the algorithms that manage platforms in order for women to be able to get back to the platform bosses and say, okay, we have low performance day, like because my son is ill, so I cannot like have 100% attention there because I'm working from home and I'm doing multitask. And so I wanted to know what's your thought about that. How can we humanize more the relationships that we have with platforms, since there's no human being to talk to whenever we have a problem and we can't fulfill the demands of the algorithms that manage those platforms?
Okay, thank you for this interesting question. We'll come back to it. Moment. Eine daneben.
There's a request for the floor in the row in front of that lady who's just spoken, and then on the right-hand side, and then in the front row again. And then we will answer the questions. My name is Rainer Kinsmüller. I would like to get back to the strategic core of it all, which I saw in the presentations by Mr. Böhning and Mr. Daum. There's a paradox in here. So we have a consensus on leaving industrial capitalism, but what we're looking for is to find a resolution in digital capitalism because we don't have any other forms or alternatives. And this is how I understood your proposals. That is the suggestions through that we heard from Burmeister and Böhning. But I would like to hear your opinion, Mr. Daum, because I understood you saying that you are skeptical whether these new alternatives that led to new forms of workers, wage workers, and employees, or blue-collar or white-collar worker, whether they should be our focus for the future. But if not, what is your answer? What is your answer to the social performance being dependent on an individual, so that is that they have their basic income, or what is it that you're talking about? Thank you very much. Right next to this person, Markus, over there. So yes, Jasmina Circic from the Career Center from the University of Hamburg. I would like to ask a question which is in line with the previous statements. So I would like to focus on the gender perspective, because that would have been my most important question. And we heard in the first presentation about the halftime of knowledge, and we prepare 50,000 students for the labor market, for a market with working conditions as you just outlined. And my question would be, what are the most important, the three essential skills that we should train our students or graduates with, so that they can find their way in this new labor market? Thank you very much. We will accept one more question, and then we will have the round of answers. Björn Rinke, I am the scientific assistant at the European Parliament. I have a question for the trade unions and also for the politicians. So that is the access to digital companies and trade unions, and what are there in specific proposals in that regard. So is there a digital access right? How can we establish one? And what about the problem when the crowd workers, when they are categorized as self-employed people, so then with regard to antitrust policies, the trade unions cannot act collectively. So what are your specific ideas about that? I think that we have three different topics. One topic is that it is reducing half-time of knowledge and reskilling, and the necessity for qualification, and what do you need to have as a skill in order to survive in the new world. And we would like to start with that before we start talk about the gender aspects and the digital access. So we started talking about that individually, but maybe I can ask all three of you one more time, what do we need to do about that? Let's start with the trade union. So this is how it should be done. This gives time to the others to think about their answers. Well, technically speaking, I can't answer that question because all the jobs are different. So all the skills are different that are needed. I talked about the blockages that exist for further qualification within the companies, these in-house qualification measures. And here, 10 to 50% of the working time of the employees should be given time for qualification measures, and so that they don't need to use their free time for qualification and training measures. I don't really think it's a good idea so that everybody should learn a programming language, and I don't think that we can just say that as we will need cars also in the future, but I can't say that everybody has to learn how to make a car. And with I think that it is very important that we continue qualifying the employees in-house. And when we say that the car is changing, and if we still want to have everybody on board, but that means that people who used to work with lower skills or medium type of skills, that they were exempt from further training measures. And I always had the impression that once you have quite a lot of qualification, you have access to even more. And we need to master the situation also for people with lower skills, to also train them further. I mean, this is not your answer to the 3 core skills or competencies that people will need. I mean, but we can answer that question maybe through the other panelists. I mean, I think that it is important to have time for qualification measures in-house. So then I would like to now broaden our horizon here, and so broaden our perspective. We're not focusing on educational policies only here. And this is just a rough estimate, but let me say that every big industrial revolution has created new forms of the social state, because the capitalists, meaning the employers, but also the employees and workers, they have understood that if we want to secure a new technological pathway, then we need to make it sustainable. So with regard to growth, but also at the same time with regard to the rights of the workers and employees, and with regard to the well-being and health of the workers. And this regulation regime, that's what we could have called it before, so we need to define that, and we need to put the legal framework for that. And this happened in the 19th century, so the health insurance was invented, not because Bismarck had a good idea how to appease the workers, but also because the companies, they also found out that you can't exploit the people too intensively over the course of 3 to 4 weeks, and then they literally die because of being overburdened. And when you look at the key technology, electricity, when it was discovered between the 20s and the 50s and of the past century, and in Germany, so the pension scheme was introduced in the 50s. Because we wanted to set up a process in the core industrial sectors into enabling the modernization of the workforce, and in such a way that people will not fall into a big hole when they are no longer capable of working. So what is the pillar now that is the basis for this new industrial revolution? And I believe that this pillar, this new column, is the educational one, and it should be understood in a different way than before. And this was also reflected in the questions. But we talk about qualification measures usually when it is about adapting the skills. So, for example, we have a new software program, and we need to learn how to work with Excel spreadsheets. But this is not what we're talking about now. We're not talking about what the future generation needs, about reskilling or about upskilling, and that we need multiple skills even in the future. And I believe that this covers 2 fundamental rights, and we need to modernize them. Who funds that? Who funds it all? Is that going to be funded by the employees, as the CDU, the Conservative Party in Germany, suggested, or the general public? That is, the corporations with their profits need to pay taxes. And the second question that we need to ask, who has the right to define working hours or qualification measures, for that matter? Is that, I mean, we've been given that example, so is this the responsibility of the employee and worker, so that between family and raising children and work, they also have to slip in 2 hours for qualification measures? Or do we need to have a new structure at the workplace that there is a tendency that training measures are an integral part of your work. And this is something that we need to think about. This is the context in which we need to develop ideas. And what I find surprising in this discussion on training measures, we have been holding this discussion for a long time, but I mean, we don't really focus on the two questions that I've just asked. So where do we want to go? So people talk about social competences, about creativity, about being able to work in teams. And this is the starting point that we usually talk about. But I mean, we don't know what the skills are per industrial sector, and this is why the government here we're going to initiate the skilled workers strategy for the future. And for each industrial sector, we are going to analyze the skills that are necessary, because then we would have the possibility to have a very differentiated approach on funding the qualification. So, for example, we just suggested an opportunities account so that this can be used to finance the qualification and training measures for each individual. Thank you very much, Björn. What are the competencies and skills for the future? So you'd be happy to hear that we have a competence monitoring at the Böckler-Stiftung, so in order to find out what we need in the future. So I would like to now go over to the next question, to Timo Daum. So we're going to get back to you. So with regard to the strategic question, whether the definition of work is the industrial worker in a factory, but I would like to start talking about gender issues and algorithm issues. But this has actually two questions in it. So in the basic starting point is that the crowd-working platforms or digital platforms of any kind, providing social services and mediating services, and we have a large majority of women working there. So we see that not in every country, but in many countries. And you have mentioned a study, so that's saying that in Frank Braun said that this is very important in order to individually adapt the working forms so that people can work in this platform. But this is also a question of algorithm-based work. So you don't have a supervisor any longer that you can contact, but rather the algorithm is planning your work. This is the anonymity of the hierarchical structures, so there's no link between the employers and the employees. And these are, in fact, two isolated questions, or rather two combined questions that we should tackle. So there's one question: how can we control this black box, this algorithm box, and what does it mean, and what is its background? And at the same time, there's the second question: how can we enable women to work on digital platforms without making them prone to poverty at old age? So I hope that I have translated the questions correctly, so in what they meant in detail. And then the Labour Ministry will also be given the floor, but first of all, Timo Daum.
I would like to pick up on this gender issue. Isn't it interesting information, first of all, that we're dealing with a new labour market, which, as you said, is primarily actually shaped by women. That's very much in contrast to the conventional system, making it unusual and primarily also hopeful. Because indeed, these platforms, the click economy, does say that even people who may have to raise children, are only available for temporary work and so on, can work. So we are liberating ourselves from the traditional old-fashioned model of the male breadwinner supporting the family and so on. So that, I think, we should take note of, because it's a positive thing. But how do we get to a situation where these impersonal objects, the algorithms, can be dealt with? I think the General Data Protection Regulation is quite positive about this, because it looks at the algorithms. We can address them. And after all, there always have to be people who are responsible, human beings, which I think is probably the route we should travel in the future as well. But let's go back to the other issue, if you allow me. May I? Wonderful, thank you. That goes back to the strategic issue, because I think this new type of capitalism should not be criticized from the point of view of the old-style capitalism, which we still do far too often. Let me put it this way. The new capitalism is a better capitalism than the old one. I mean, structural gender inequality is a buzzword we know. We've had the old-style capitalism for 150 years, and we still have a gender pay gap. That also is reflected in the pension. It's about 40% in Germany, which is one of the most progressive countries after all. We still have a 20% pay gap in general terms. So as far as gender gaps and gender equality is concerned, old-style capitalism hasn't really developed enough yet. And another thing, in order to go this stark contrast to old and new capitalism, this paradigm of full-time employment and growth, that is something which has led to the surplus production problems, which particularly in ecological terms is beginning to suffocate our world. The third matter is something which touches on the whole educational issue again. After all, why is it so threatening? If my knowledge is no longer necessary, if a robot or somebody else can do it better than I do, why is that an existential threat for an individual? It is because your gainful employment is linked to that. In other words, your economic existence, this work ethos and the idea of I train for a job and will do that job for the rest of my life and I earn money from it and whatever. This is a concept we have to wave goodbye to. Thanks very much. I've got so many different strands in my hand and I'm trying to juggle all these things around. Now, I want to ask Mr. Burmeister, if an algorithm is the boss, how can a Works Council and a union get into this black box? That's less a question of strategic access, but more a question of how do unions get any access to this post-industrial type of gainful employment? I think that's enough for the time being. Then we go on and then I'll ask Björn a question. So let's see how I can answer these questions. In many big companies, our experience in the HR department is that we now have AI systems already which give the answers that you were asking a human being before. Some workers and employees think it's a good thing, but the basic principle is that computer or the algorithm can never be your last point of call. Behind it, there always has to be, and I'm thinking in terms of a conventional company still, company structure, you know, today's capitalism, old-style capitalism as you call it. So I'm still having this, so in the traditional companies, that's still my area to think about the new one, of course, but as things are, I still have to have somebody, a human being responsible in HR that I can talk to and that I can also hold responsible. As a counterpart, an algorithm isn't somebody I can contend with, because it makes very clear it's not the algorithm that falls like manna from heaven as if it was a law of nature. An algorithm is created in the first place. And then we, quite apart from that, I don't really understand how it all works, but, as a union, we have to have a level playing field with this new setup. And we have to have a say in how algorithms are developed. And I've told you that I have certain deficits in this respect. But still, the point is that I always have to look how the needs of people can be addressed. And my union colleague from Kenya talked about the working situation of women in the click economy. I mean, how can I make sure that I have employees working without their social concerns being ignored, that the algorithm takes it into concern? And that also means the gender issue that we addressed, namely working hours or combining career and family, and for both genders. So what we need is a debate how algorithms, how AI is controlled. And it's not a purely technical systems. There are interests involved in this, and our own interests have to be involved if that becomes our reality. That was the first question. What's the second question? The second question is access. How will a union have access to a digital platform? Let's give you one example. Helplink. Helplink offers social services for private households. And the people go into the private households. The Fedora delivery people, you could still organize when they're out riding their bicycles. How can you get to the platform workers that are invisible? You do so by giving them a face and transparency. IG Metall has created a platform called Fair Crowdwork. And with this platform, we offer an opportunity for these new types of work, which do exist, to be used as an exchange platform for people who are working there and to publicize their working conditions. Because I think this debate we've just had about the delivery services, and we're seeing the drivers delivering Meals on Wheels and whatever, have to be made visible. They show that they want to do it. They're self-organizing, and I find that hopeful. And the Ryanair strike, or the many activities in Ryanair, bear witness to that, as do the activities among the bicycle couriers. So we see that people are coming together to defend their own interests. I mean, that's still what is going to be imperative. Fair Crowd is an important platform helping people to network. I think I'm not allowing you to say union in our old hat. Obviously, we're trying to face up to the challenges of new working conditions, and the crux in the future will be to make sure that we find decent ways of regulation for the labour of the future. We want to do that together with the people who become active, and there are lots of them. Thank you, Kai. Now I have a whole host of questions, and Björn sees them all coming towards him, but we can't ask the ministry to do everything. So where do we start? Obviously, we could discuss the question as to what are the framework conditions that trade unions need in order to have access to the digital platforms, which they do not yet have. Equally, we have a question of gender, full-time employment. So where would you like to answer immediately? Well, obviously, I could say lots of individual issues, but I'm still sort of thinking about this issue, whether the new type of capitalism can be connected with or criticized from the point of view of the old style of capitalism. I think what Kai said, or wrote, I don't know whether he said it, but he certainly wrote it, namely that with every new industrial revolution, questions of power and interests had to be readdressed. And these were not resolved. I think that's very important to be aware of. Obviously, we've created a sort of information set from labour law, social law, works constitutions, and so on. All of that has made it possible that the conventional capitalism, which, open bracket, isn't yet over, close bracket, can be regulated. And what we've done has not been without success, at least for the countries of the so-called West. In the so-called East, it's slightly different. When you're looking towards Africa, it's even different there. But at least for the traditional Western economies, that effort at regulation has been fairly successful, and we've got 4.9 unemployed, 2.x% long-term unemployed, but we are more or less on the road to full employment, although still removed from that. But we're seeing many new things happening. All the same, I need to ask the question, what are the new power relations that are emerging, and what has it to do with artificial intelligence? May I decide in future what labour is worth, yet or no? I say no. It's got to be up to people to decide what worth is to be assessed to a job, and it's got to be employers and employees. But what we're seeing in the platform economy is that clicks or likes assess people's work. And in concrete terms, it has to do with the salary that people get. Is that the future we want? Because that is an exercise of power which makes it no longer possible for the employer to negotiate this, and it is up to the guy who said, well, the person who delivered my pizza was nice or not nice. Is that the idea that we have of the capitalism of the future? I would say no. I actually wouldn't think that is modern. And another question is one where we are very topical, goes back to the question that Timo talked about, that is the unconditional basic income. Is it true that in modern capitalism, we are just always looking at the new types of jobs that are emerging and not the ones that never come into being? Because when we're talking about the basic income, the 1.3 million I talked about, that's a number of jobs which are in danger because of automation. If that is a complete job shedding, then we need something for the people to shut them up. I think what we need is a completely different solution. We need development. We need the development of labour markets that we haven't opened up at all. Why is it not possible in Germany that the care and education sector can be upvalued, so we get massive new jobs emerging there? Why is that possible? And how is it possible that service for people, which I may call that, isn't considered an integral part of modern capitalism? Because it's not just something which fulfills a function necessary for society, but also it's necessary in economic terms. Björn, we've only got 1 minute left, and now everybody wants to say something. But yeah, sure, you will start. Yes, it is a huge problem because we are trying to find paid full-time work, but we're also looking for jobs rather than activities. The coal miners, they don't say, okay, makes sense to stop lignite fuel. They say, I need this to continue because my job is linked to that in my existence, and that's why you have this open cast mining. We have other sessions which will look into all sorts of questions like basic income and whatever. We have to come to a stop, but Kai, very briefly. Let me reiterate. I'm totally in favor of not having just a debate, with rosy-colored spectacles. We can be controversial about this. I think work for many people is more than simply what you need to earn a living. Work, chats with colleagues, that sort of thing. Many of you will know this. So this discussion, which is also a discussion we had yesterday about the basic income, that's something which I take as a sort of fair weather debate, if you like, because today we find ourselves in a situation where we have a high level of employment. People are actually working too long these days. But if, because of the digital revolution, many jobs will be shed, then we should also discuss how we can cut working hours. Because in companies these days, we've got people working too many hours rather than creating a society where we say you're no longer necessary, so you're getting something to keep you make you shut up, to keep you quiet. Sorry about this. I have to suffocate things. It's a good thing that, we had so much of a debate. I had to interrupt. But you've given us lots of questions to debate over lunch. So we've got massive food for thoughts, certainly for the rest of the day, if not more. Let me thanks to all the people in the debate, men and women. Well, I nearly said women, but of course there were only men. But everybody in the audience, thanks very much for this exciting discussion and enjoy your lunch break.